The FunnyPlaying FPGBC is an awesome, affordable IPS screened FPGA Game Boy Color built by you. Eight-bit joystick. I am going to review the fresh FunnyPlaying FPGBC, a somewhat easy-to-build, affordable, high-quality FPGA Game Boy Color that uses no original Nintendo parts, yet is fully compatible with all games and is built with convenient modern tech. Sometimes, faking it is better than the real thing. It's like the Veggie Impossible Burger of Game Boys. It is the I can't believe it's not butter of Game Boys. There are absolutely no original Nintendo parts, and I sort of love it. I don't even know how to solder, but I built this most triumphant FPGA Game Boy Color system just by using screwdrivers. First, I'm going to review the system, and then I'll go over how to put it together and share the things that I wish I knew beforehand so you can too. You know you want to be one of the cool kids and like this video. This guy wanted you to subscribe to this channel because we make videos like this that you can watch each Saturday morning. Now, onto the review. FunnyPlaying has been making a variety of well-regarded mods for Game Boy and Game Boy Advance lines, including battery mods, replacement motherboards, and high-quality IPS screens. So this kit is the next step. Instead of making replacement parts for existing Game Boy systems, they are making kits for entire replacement Game Boys. Once you have it all assembled, on the front you will find a Nintendo-style D-pad which feels absolutely perfect, just like original hardware. Some people think that the membrane is a little tough, but it actually hasn't worn in yet. Then there are the start and select buttons and A and B buttons, which are clicky and so accurate they can actually be used in real Nintendo systems. Then there is a speaker grill on the lower right and a gorgeous big IPS screen which has different modes but the correct Game Boy aspect ratio. On the right side there is a power switch, and on top there is the IR blaster port. On the left there is the Game Boy cable port and a volume rocker. Instead of having a wheel, you can click the rocker upwards and downwards to change the volume. On the bottom, there is a headphone jack and the USB-C charging port. Then on the back of the unit, there is the Game Boy cartridge slot and the battery cover which holds the rechargeable battery. The IPS screen delivers really bright, really sharp colors. FunnyPlaying is known for making some of the best IPS screens for the Game Boy family, so it's pretty cool that you get to have one of their best screens without having to need to use a soldering gun to install it. The Game Boy screen handles Game Boy transparency perfectly. Now, the miracle at the heart of this unit is a Go-In FPGA chip, which uses forward programmable gate array technology to instantly recreate a virtual Game Boy CPU and GPU, thus allowing you to play hardware-accurate games simply and reliably. Technically, this is a clone, but it's a high-quality FPGA clone that can rival the Analogue Pocket at much less than half the price. It cannot run Game Boy Advance or other systems, but it does a damn fine job of playing every Game Boy and Game Boy Color game. But sometimes you are going to need to toggle the Game Boy Color fix mode in the BIOS in order to display it correctly. They have their own FunnyPlaying clone BIOS, and I love seeing their logo on screen when you turn it on. It is a deliciously retro experience. You put in a cartridge, you flip the switch, and the game starts playing. When you click the volume rocker inwards, it brings up the on-screen menu, which you use to adjust the settings of the BIOS, and that's super important because you need to do that in order for the regular operation of the system. Then, once you're in the BIOS, then you can use the D-pad and the buttons to make your choices. The system menu can be adjusted during gameplay, and it does not pause the game, so I recommend that you pause it before fiddling in the menu. On the top, there is the backlight brightness setting that you can change the settings by hitting A and B, and you can see the results instantly. And then there is the sound volume. Then there is the screen modes, and I'll get into that in the next section. I like how you can see the changes to the graphic modes when you have the menu open, so you can see the changes instantly. Then there is the core selector, where you can choose between the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy Core. In order to switch between them, you need to save this setting and then either select the reset menu or turn the power off and on. Below that is the Game Boy palette, and when you are playing a Game Boy game in the Game Boy Core mode, you can swap between the available palettes and it will show you the results instantly. Then there is the frame mix, which I believe is frame blending. Some original Game Boy games and Game Boy Color games did use frame blending. A lot of software emulators do not do Game Boy frame blendings correctly, and this can cause the transparency in some games not to show. But sometimes, if you leave this on, it can lead to a little shimmer. You can toggle this depending on the game that you're playing as needed. Then there is the super important setting, the Game Boy Color Fix toggle setting. Certain Game Boy games do not display correctly in the Game Boy Color core unless this is enabled, but when it is enabled, it can cause Game Boy Color games not to display correctly until you turn it off. So if you're in the Game Boy Color core and you find yourself switching between Game Boy Color and Game Boy games, get used to flipping this on and off, or just switch between the Game Boy Core or the Game Boy Color FPGA core. Luckily, changing the Game Boy Color Fix setting can be done on the fly and does not require you to reboot the unit. Switching between the Game Boy Core and the Game Boy Color core does require you to reboot the unit either with a power switch or by the reset button in the BIOS menu. There is a speed setting which maxes out at 125% for a little peppier Pokemon action, but I like to keep it at 100. Then there is the BIOS version, which I'm running 1.06, which is the latest version as of recording this video. And then there is the reset option, which is a soft reboot without having to hit the power switch, and I'm glad that they included it. And then there is the save setting, which allows you to save the changes to the BIOS. It's important to note that you need to hit save in order to save your changes if you want them to remain in place after the next reboot. There are only 3 screen modes, but they're all really good. I can see myself wanting to use all of them. Full screen mode takes up all of the LCD panel, and it is scaled to perfect crisp pixels in the correct aspect ratio and is super bright. It looks the most like a high-quality emulator or the Analogue Pocket in regular mode. 4X mode displays an incredibly crisp image, but without a dot matrix grid. It is a 4X integer scale, which has the Game Boy and Game Boy Color games displayed with a 4 pixels for each pixel, but with no spacing in between. It has the same size and aspect ratio as a Game Boy Color screen, but with black borders on all sides. But since the IPS blacks are quite black, it actually looks quite like an original screen, but better. Next is the 4XP mode, which uses some of the available pixels to create a dot matrix pixel grid. Since 3/4 of them are black, it often looks better if you crank the brightness all the way up, but this gives it a very authentic Game Boy feel. The Game Boy's original codename is the Dot Matrix Game. X4P mode gives you a very accurate feel. It is darker than the other ones, but it is still a lot easier to see than any of the original Game Boy hardware. The 1800 mAh lithium battery pack delivers between 5 and 6 hours of battery life at maximum brightness, and even more if you crank it down. The screen is actually pretty bright, and I actually find it more comfortable to play at less than 100% brightness. There is no Bluetooth or wireless charging, but that's okay because this is a deliberately retro device. The battery life is actually pretty good considering that you never have to buy batteries and it's super easy to charge with any USB-C charger. It works like a champ with my EverDrive GBX7. That EverDrive has built-in save states, and it's awesome because there are no save states with the FPGC. The EverDrive GBX7 is going to be living inside this system from now on. They are great together. The basic kit is $69, but it requires a FunnyPlaying shell, buttons, and membranes that takes the cost up to $83, and that includes shipping, which is still quite an awesome bargain because it's way cheaper than you can get a Game Boy Color with an IPS screen and a USB-C recharging battery mod. Heck, it's almost cheaper than just buying the mods themselves, but you can put it together in minutes. Now, if you compare this to an original Game Boy Color hardware, this beats the living pants off original hardware, in part to the bright, crisp LCD screen that is a joy to use. I actually had a hard time recording video comparing the two. Even in optimum lighting conditions, my camera had a hard time picking up the original hardware's LCD screen, which was not backlit and incredibly dim, or showed reflections of me and my phone. Now, the system that this is going to be compared to the most is the Analogue Pocket. The Analogue Pocket is almost 2.5 times the cost of the FPGBC, and it is considerably more powerful, bigger, and heavier. The Analogue Pocket can play Game Boy Advance and has expanded cartridge options via adapters, as well as Open FPGA, which allows you to run a huge plethora of retro video games off its SD card. I don't see them in direct competition one to another, but they complement each other quite well. If you want to go with a full-fat, super luxury experience, then pony up the money for an Analogue Pocket. But if you want to focus on playing Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, and you want something super affordable that you can throw in your pocket and not worry about, then I would go with the FPGBC. Why not both? Both is good. So, if you just look at the tech specs, you would think that the Analogue Pocket wins hands down. However, there are advantages to being leaner, smaller, and simpler that can make the FPGBC even more attractive for some people. The Analogue Pocket is $271 once you factor in shipping, while the FPGBC is just $84. So, it's a third the cost of an Analogue Pocket, and it's smaller and more compact. It's easier to throw into your bag and not have to worry about something happening to it. I'm not going to do any drop tests, but my FPGBC, but since it's based on the sturdy Game Boy Color design, I suspect it would do quite well. It is at a wonderful halfway point between retro nostalgia and the modern conveniences of IPS displays, FPGA accuracy, and modern USB-C rechargeable charging. This kit is designed for people who are curious about modding a Game Boy, but they don't know where to begin and they want a nice entry point. The FPGBC is right there riding the line between original hardware and modern conveniences. So this kit is a great choice for a nerd in your life who has Game Boy cartridges but hasn't shelled out $220 for an Analogue Pocket. Why a kit? It is both high-tech and yet a deliberate throwback to previous times, both in the system and how it is sold. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there were hobby kits where you could buy components to assemble various pieces of electronics, such as radios, clocks, and even computers. It's like if you buy a whole chicken and then roast it and cut it up yourself, it is way cheaper. And often we don't think about the labor that goes into building our electronic devices, but it definitely impacts the total cost of the products. By cutting out the assembly process, they are able to pass on the savings to you. It is also a lot of fun, and you tend to have more of a familial bit of ownership to something that you put together yourself. My personal touch gives me a personal connection to this particular unit. But I also do think that there's a market for pre-assembled FPGBC systems.
Hey Guy, I'm going to be assembling electronics and I do not require feline assistance at this point.
So I want to give a shout out to Macho Nacho Productions for their video on the FPGBC, which was essential for me to get one and to safely assemble it. The Macho Nacho Productions assembly method has you test everything ahead of time, which is good, and to use a piece of paper or cardboard in between the screen and the motherboard to make sure that you don't touch it inappropriately and short out during testing. It also has you install the buttons and speakers first before the motherboard, and install only 2 of the internal motherboard screws, which I wish I would have done that instead of all 3, and then finally affix the screen before installing the battery. Now, I selected the wrong buttons from their website. I didn't realize that the buttons that I picked said GBP and not GBC. They were for the Game Boy Pocket and not the Game Boy Color. The buttons on the Game Boy Color have a slightly different registration holes on them, and they have A and B embossed on them, and the Game Boy Pocket D-pad is ever so slightly smaller. For my first build, I used the Game Boy Pocket buttons, and I had to cut 2 of the registration tabs off in order to get them to fit into the holes using a utility knife. They didn't quite rise up quite as much as I would have liked, and the D-pad was loose. So I decided to buy Game Boy Color buttons and a D-pad on Amazon and have it sent via 1-day shipping. It would have been cheaper if I just would have gotten the correct buttons in the first place, so learn from my mistake. So in order to assemble this, you need a Phillips jeweler's screwdriver to handle the 3 internal screws on the motherboard. And you also need a long tri-wing screwdriver. It's weird that they decided to use Nintendo's security bit screws on the case, which is a weird choice. They actually recreated one of the slightly more inconvenient things about the original hardware. This wouldn't be a problem for most people who are into the Game Boy modding scene and probably already have those tools. But this kit is marketed towards regular civilians who don't have the inner knowledge of the Game Boy modding scene, and they are possibly going to be without the proper tools. I think that they should have offered an optional screwdriver kit for the noobs. I'm very glad that I had the Bootleg Buddy toolkit from Pink Gorilla Games in Seattle, Washington, which had all of the essential screwdrivers, including the tri-wing. Another thing about the motherboard screws is that the case does not have the internal 3 motherboard screws pre-threaded, meaning you have to have a screwdriver and press down really hard while turning in order to get them into the holes without stripping the screws. While watching the Macho Nacho video, he says actually do not use the middle 3rd screwdriver hole because there's a chance that it's going to crack the case. I didn't crack the case in my initial install process, but later on when I swapped out the buttons for the ones that actually fit correctly, I put the middle screw in and the case cracked. I did try to hold the motherboard in place while trying to get the screw into the unthreaded hole. In doing so, I created a little star crack in the internal side. It's not all the way through, but it spoils a formerly perfect aesthetic. Another thing is I didn't know that they were going to include a sticker set for the Game Boy Color. Their website doesn't mention this, so I didn't know it was going to be included, so I paid $8 to get my own sticker set on Amazon. Luckily, when I found out that they did include a sticker set, I was able to return it and get my money back. I do think it is incredibly delicious to apply the Nintendo Authorized Repair Center phone number sticker and the Nintendo unit code and product information stickers on the back of a completely bootleg Game Boy. Of all the things I'm surprised that they're able to get away with, there's a really decent looking Nintendo logo on the front of the case. There is surprisingly less light bleed than I would have anticipated since it has a super bright LCD screen and the case that I chose is literally completely transparent. The color for the case that I chose is transparent milky white, but the color really is more completely clear. So I intended it looking like a little milky white, but since the motherboard is a really dark gray, it ended up looking almost completely black. Aesthetically, it really looks like it came out in the early 2000s with a transparent case, and it is pretty goddamn groovy. I love it. The assembly documentation is completely non-existent. There are things that I would have done differently if I had known about them ahead of time, but the purpose of proper documentation is to help people do it right the first time. So I wish that they had better documentation. I wish that they would have had a QR code to a PDF instruction manual, and they could have learned a lot from IKEA in pretty much any model building kit. I would have to say that the assembly process was medium difficult because of these unknown factors. But the kit is actually really well engineered, and it would be super easy for me to put one together again. If they would have included better documentation, I don't think I would have had these problems, so I hope that they improve this in the future. I literally had to look up other YouTube videos to find out essential steps as far as how to manipulate the internal connector ports because I'm not that experienced in restoring or modding or repairing electronics. I didn't realize that the lock that you have to use to attach the screen ribbon to the motherboard is unlocked by flipping the back up, and it is locked by flipping down. I had to look that up on a video because I didn't want to mess it up. I also had difficulty disconnecting the speaker after attaching it for the pre-build component test, and I didn't realize that all you have to do is to just pull upwards with the pliers, but yank pretty strongly to get it to come up. I also would have liked to know that you have to actually seat the speaker in the case before you place the motherboard in. These are all these little bits of information that you need to know ahead of time, and it would greatly improve the assembly process. Apparently, the onboard BIOS can be updated via the USB-C port by plugging it into a computer and booting it up as a drive and dragging an update file onto it. Apparently, this is only approved if you use Microsoft Windows, and I'm sort of surprised by this because I use macOS and Chrome OS with most of my retro gaming devices without any issues. I don't know if you really need to use a Windows PC to do it, or if they haven't tested it on other operating systems. But I received the latest version of the motherboard revision and the latest BIOS for it, so I don't plan on messing with it. So I didn't need this, but once I learned about it, I knew that I wanted it. It lines up perfectly with the experience of playing Game Boy original hardware and original cartridges, but in 2024 with modern conveniences. I suspect that if you're watching this video, you yourself might be curious about playing modded Game Boy or FPGA hardware, and if that's the case, then it's going to be a fun project for you, and you get a really awesome piece of video game hardware when you're done. This thing is a great alternative to an IPS modded Game Boy Pocket, Color, or DMG, and it's very affordable too. There is just something special about playing classic games on cartridge, the Game Boy form factor, and enjoying a piece of electronics that you put together by yourself. I'm very pleased with the quality of the FPGBC, and I hope that it is refined in the future by better documentation. And I'll be very interested to see if the company makes any follow-up products, such as a Game Boy Advance clone. I wish that Nintendo made products like this, and I'm glad that there are great companies out there making awesome stuff like this. This guy wanted you to know that we make awesome videos like this each week, so subscribe so you don't miss out. This is 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome. Play retro.